When I received the message that my massage appointment had been cancelled, I felt an emptiness that was deeper than just disappointment. It was supposed to be the only hour this week where someone would touch me, even professionally. I stared at the screen for a long moment, rereading the short sentence. Unfortunately, due to illness, your session is cancelled. Sorry for the inconvenience. It wasn't just inconvenient. It was devastating. I had chosen the massage carefully, not too expensive, not too intimate, just enough to remind my body that it still existed. That I still existed. I sat there, phone in hand, robe barely tied, candles already burning around the living room. I had prepared everything. Music, warmth, stillness. The scent of lavender oil floated in the air, a quiet promise of relief I would now never get. And just as I was about to blow out the candles, I heard footsteps behind me. Is everything okay? A calm voice asked. I turned, it was him. He had just arrived hours ago. I hadn't expected him for the weekend, but he had said something vague about needing a change of pace. I hadn't questioned it. But now he stood there, eyes curious, watching me more closely than anyone had in a very long time. I told him the appointment had been cancelled. I tried to smile. I made a joke about my back surviving another week without help. He hesitated, then said something I never expected. You know, I did a course in sports therapy last year. If you want, I can try. Just help relieve the tension. Shoulders only. I laughed nervously. I wanted to say no. But I didn't. Not because I believed he was qualified. Not because I thought it would help. But because I needed to feel that someone, anyone, could see that I was more than a silent wife, more than a mother by marriage. I nodded slowly. He smiled. That was the first step. And it was the last moment I could ever pretend nothing was about to change. Before I tell you what happened next, please write in the comments where you're watching this from, and tell me, have you ever had a secret you tried to keep buried, only to watch it surface at the worst possible time? It started with a scent. Not the one from the lavender candles I had lit. Not the oils I had laid out in preparation for the massage that never came. It was something else, something sharper, more awake. The scent of presence. Of someone being near. Of being noticed. I had gotten used to my body being a ghost in this house. After so many years of quiet routines, polite dinners, and wordless goodnights, I had adjusted to being invisible, even to the man I called my husband. He was not cruel. He was just distant. Predictable in his forgetfulness. Reliable in his absence. When he left for work each morning without a goodbye kiss or even a glance, I reminded myself not to take it personally. This was just marriage at 50. At least, that's what I told myself. So when the massage was cancelled, I felt more than disappointment. I felt robbed. That hour, that physical reminder that I still had skin, muscles, and needs, it was all I'd been clinging to for weeks. I needed to feel someone else's hands on my back, if only to remember I had one. And then he showed up. He wasn't supposed to be there. He rarely came by without calling first. But that day, he walked through the door as if the universe had summoned him. I hadn't seen him in months, though we exchanged occasional texts. He was grown now, living in the city, building his own life. The boy who used to sulk around the house was now a man with a quiet confidence that unsettled me. When he offered to help, just your shoulders, if it helps, I should have said no. But his voice was gentle. Steady. No suggestion in his tone, no wrongness in his face. Just care. A kind of carefulness I hadn't felt in years. I agreed. And that one word felt like betrayal. He told me to sit, and I did. I tried to joke, to keep it light. But the second his hands touched my shoulders, everything shifted. I didn't expect his touch to feel so measured. Not clinical, not casual. Thoughtful. He didn't speak as he worked. Just breathed evenly, fingertips tracing slow circles near my neck. It wasn't arousal I felt. Not yet. It was grief. I grieved the intimacy I once had. The conversations I no longer shared. The evenings filled with separate silences, two lives running parallel without ever crossing. I grieved the fact that this, a borrowed moment of attention, felt like the most tenderness I had received in years. He must have sensed something change. His hands paused. "Is this too much?" he asked. I shook my head. "It's fine." But it wasn't. It was everything I had longed for, disguised as something harmless. He continued, more cautiously now. His thumbs pressed down along my spine, and I felt my body react, not in a way I could define, but in a way I couldn't deny. My throat tightened. My hands clenched around the fabric of my robe. I tried to focus on something else, the sound of the clock ticking, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the flickering candlelight dancing on the walls. But it all blurred into a single, throbbing awareness: he was touching me. And I wanted him to. Not him, specifically. But someone. Anyone. That made it worse. Because in that moment, I wasn't just betraying my husband. I was betraying the woman I had convinced myself I still was: loyal, dignified, above weakness. His hands slowed. He asked if I needed a break. I said no, maybe too quickly. He resumed. And I hated myself for how much I wanted it to last. When he finally pulled away, I realized I hadn't spoken in minutes. I turned slightly, thanked him, tried to smile. His eyes searched mine for something: permission? Confession? I don't know. But I stood up and said I needed a shower. He nodded, stepping back as I passed. In the bathroom, I sat on the edge of the tub, trembling. Not from guilt. Not even from confusion. From the terrifying clarity that something inside me had shifted. And no matter what I told myself, that it was just a massage, just a moment, just a human response to loneliness, I knew better. This wasn't over. It had just begun. The next morning arrived with a brightness that felt inappropriate, as if the world had no idea what had happened inside me the night before. Sunlight poured through the bedroom curtains, illuminating the floorboards, the neatly folded blanket at the foot of the bed, the quiet stillness of my room. I hadn't slept. I had spent most of the night sitting upright against the headboard, wrapped in my robe, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the house felt too quiet. I could hear faint sounds from the kitchen, clinking dishes, a cupboard closing. My body moved without instruction, guiding me toward the noise. I found him standing at the counter, barefoot, his back to me, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He didn't turn when I entered. "I figured you might want one," he said, his voice even, almost rehearsed. I stood there, unsure what to do with my arms, unsure what version of myself to wear this morning. I nodded and walked toward the table, sitting slowly. The chair felt cold against my legs. I watched him as he placed the mug in front of me. He was composed. Not casual, not apologetic, just calm. As if nothing had happened. Or maybe, as if something had, and he'd already accepted it. I, on the other hand, was still trying to decide whether it had been real at all. He sat across from me, silently. The only sounds were the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall and the gentle stir of spoons in ceramic. I looked down at my hands. I had painted my nails last week, trying to remind myself that I was still a woman and not just a role, not just a wife, a homemaker, a figure in someone else's routine. But now, even that felt performative. The pale pink polish seemed to mock me. I cleared my throat and finally spoke, though my voice came out thinner than expected. Thank you. For yesterday. He looked at me then, truly looked. His eyes held no judgment. No presumption. Only awareness. You seemed like you needed it, he said simply. I didn't respond. I didn't trust my voice not to crack. Instead, I nodded again and took a sip of the coffee. It was stronger than I liked, but I drank it anyway. It anchored me. Kept me from unraveling. The hours that followed were painfully mundane. I cleaned the kitchen. I changed the sheets in the guest room. I folded laundry I had been ignoring. He spent most of the day outside, tinkering with things I hadn't realized needed tinkering, fixing a loose fence post, rearranging the tools in the shed. We crossed paths only once or twice, exchanging neutral words about weather and dinner. But each time our eyes met, there was a weight in the air. A pause. An echo of something that had happened, or was about to. That afternoon, I found myself in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. I needed to feel something physical. Something real. The soil under my nails, the resistance of roots, the ache in my back, all of it grounded me. I could pretend that I was just tired. That this tension in my chest was just from bending over too long. But it wasn't. It was the memory of his hands. The steadiness of his breath. The way he had touched me without demanding anything. The way my body had betrayed me by responding. I went inside and took a long shower. I scrubbed harder than usual, as if trying to erase evidence. As if guilt could be washed off. But when I stepped out and wiped the steam from the mirror, I didn't see guilt in my reflection. I saw confusion. Hunger. The faint shadow of a woman I had buried long ago. By evening, I had decided to act like nothing had happened. If he could, then so could I. I made dinner, grilled chicken, vegetables, rice, something neutral, something unremarkable. He complimented the food. I smiled politely. We discussed his job, his apartment, a friend of his getting engaged. Nothing personal. Nothing dangerous. But then, after we had cleared the plates and I was drying my hands at the sink, I heard him speak behind me, low and deliberate. You seem different. I froze. Different how? He hesitated before answering. Not worse. Just more awake. I turned, slowly. His expression was unreadable. Maybe I'm just tired, I said. He nodded, as if accepting the excuse. But the silence that followed was not empty. It pulsed. Later, as I walked past the living room on my way to bed, I saw him seated on the couch, reading something on his phone. I paused for a second, and he looked up. Our eyes met. We didn't say a word. But the look lingered. Not flirtation. Not regret. Recognition. Upstairs, in my bedroom, I stood by the window for a long time, staring into the darkness. I could see the faint outline of the garden below, the tools he had left leaning against the wall, the light from the guest room flickering behind the curtains. I told myself I was strong. That I was in control. That what had happened was a one-time mistake born of vulnerability. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. It wasn't about him. It was about being seen. Being touched. Being reminded that I was still here. As I slid under the covers, I thought of the way his voice had sounded that morning, steady, without expectation. I thought of the way he had looked at me, not with desire, but with something else. Something more dangerous. Understanding. And I wasn't ready for what that meant. Not yet. But I also knew I wasn't ready to go back to being invisible. Not ever again. The following day unfolded in slow, deliberate silence, the kind that feels more like anticipation than peace. Every sound in the house seemed louder, more intrusive, the hum of the refrigerator, the clink of a spoon against porcelain, the creak of floorboards beneath careful steps. I moved through my routines with robotic precision, folding laundry I had no interest in, straightening cushions that didn't need adjusting, and avoiding the mirrors entirely. I didn't want to see myself. Not yet. He stayed outside for most of the morning, tending to small things around the yard, pulling weeds, fixing the latch on the gate, even sweeping the front porch. I watched him through the kitchen window for a moment, the way he moved with quiet focus, sleeves rolled up, forearms dusted with dirt. It would have been easy to assign innocence to his actions, to believe that he was simply helping out, simply passing time. But I knew better. There was a stillness in him, a patience that unnerved me. He wasn't avoiding me. He was giving me space. I appreciated that more than I could say. But space didn't help with the ache that had settled somewhere deep inside me, the ache that came from being seen for a moment and then left alone with that awareness. It wasn't a craving for more, not exactly. It was the confusion of not knowing what I had become, of feeling like the rules I had lived by were beginning to crumble beneath my feet. Around noon, I made tea. Something warm, something grounding. As I poured the water into 2 mugs out of habit, I heard the back door open. He stepped in, brushing dust from his jeans, his face flushed from the sun. He greeted me casually, as if nothing at all sat unspoken between us, as if we hadn't crossed a fragile boundary just days ago. I slid one of the mugs toward him. He accepted it with a nod of thanks. We stood in the kitchen, drinking in silence, and I tried to convince myself that this could be normal. That people could live inside a tension like this and still function. But the silence between us wasn't empty. It was stretched tight, humming with what wasn't being said. The weight of our last interaction hung between us like the last notes of a song that hadn't truly ended. After lunch, I went for a walk. I didn't tell him I was leaving. I didn't take my phone. I just needed movement, air, the illusion of control. The sun was warm on my skin, the breeze gentle, but even the beauty of the afternoon couldn't distract me from the unrest inside. I followed the narrow trail through the trees behind our house, the one we used to walk on during family weekends. Back when silence between people meant comfort, not uncertainty. I sat on a bench at the edge of the woods, looking out at the small clearing beyond. There was a time I used to come here just to think, to escape the noise of life. Now it was the silence I was trying to escape. The silence in my marriage, in my home, in myself. It wasn't just the absence of affection. It was the absence of being acknowledged as someone who still had needs. Desires. Emotions that didn't fit neatly into the categories of mother, wife, hostess. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being a woman and become a function. And no one seemed to notice. Not even me. Until recently. When I returned home, the house was quiet again. He wasn't in the living room, nor the kitchen. I climbed the stairs slowly, not intending to find him, but not avoiding the possibility either. His door was slightly ajar. I paused in the hallway, then continued past it to my own room, heart beating a little too fast for no good reason. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I tried to distract myself with the rhythm of chopping vegetables and the hiss of the pan. He joined me in the kitchen without a word, setting the table, moving with a calm efficiency that only heightened my awareness of him. Everything he did seemed deliberate. Not calculated, just present. We ate quietly. I commented on the weather. He responded with something about rain expected the next day. It was small talk, but it carried an undertone neither of us acknowledged. We were dancing around something invisible, something we had both invited and feared. After dinner, I sat in the living room with a book, pretending to read. I turned the pages at regular intervals, eyes grazing the words but retaining nothing. I could feel him nearby, though he stayed out of sight. The air felt charged, as if the house itself had become aware of us. When he did finally enter the room, he didn't speak. He sat across from me, picked up a magazine from the coffee table, and flipped through it without looking at the pages. The quiet between us thickened. I closed my book, marking the page with a ribbon I didn't need. "Are you staying long?" I asked, my voice barely louder than the ticking clock. He looked up. "Not sure yet. I haven't decided." I nodded slowly. It wasn't the answer I expected, and it wasn't clear what I wanted him to say. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, and walked toward the kitchen, under the pretense of making tea. He didn't follow. But I could feel his gaze on my back, even after I turned the corner. That night, I lay in bed with the window open, listening to the wind shift through the trees. I didn't cry. I didn't plan. I just existed, suspended between choices I hadn't made and consequences I didn't yet understand. I told myself that nothing had happened. That one moment did not define me. But in the deepest part of me, I knew that wasn't true. Because something had happened. And it was still happening. The morning came with a quiet that felt deliberate, as though the house itself had settled into watchful stillness. I awoke before sunrise, not because I had rested well but because my body refused to sleep any longer. I lay still for a while, listening to the birds stir in the trees beyond the window, the occasional creak of the walls adjusting to the new day. The blanket felt heavy across my legs, more like a weight than a comfort. When I finally rose, I did so with the carefulness of someone trying not to wake another person, though I was alone in the room. Downstairs, I moved through the familiar rhythm of making coffee, measuring grounds, waiting for the water to heat. There was comfort in the repetition, but also a faint sense of surveillance, like I was aware of myself in a way I hadn't been before. Every gesture felt performed. Every movement calculated. I didn't know if he was awake yet, but the possibility that he might walk in at any moment was enough to set my nerves on edge. The coffee was bitter. I drank it anyway. Around mid-morning, I heard footsteps above me. Not rushed or purposeful, just casual. I imagined him brushing his teeth, pulling on a t-shirt, looking out the guest room window the way I used to when this house still felt new to me. A few minutes later, he entered the kitchen. His hair was still slightly damp from the shower. He greeted me with a simple morning, and I returned it without turning around. The air between us held the same restrained politeness as the day before, but it was laced with a tension that had started to feel almost normal. He made toast. We ate at the table in silence, our eyes occasionally meeting over the rim of a mug or the edge of a plate. Every time our gazes locked, I felt a subtle pull, not romantic, not seductive, just something undeniable. A recognition of what had been set into motion and what neither of us dared to name. After breakfast, I busied myself with cleaning. The kind of unnecessary, obsessive cleaning I hadn't done in years. I wiped already clean countertops, rearranged pantry shelves, even scrubbed the grout between tiles on my hands and knees. He worked outside, pruning the hedges and moving flower pots around the porch. We moved in parallel, our tasks separate but synchronized, as if afraid to disrupt the balance. By early afternoon, clouds began to gather in the sky. The wind picked up, rustling the trees with more urgency than before. I stood at the back door, watching him adjust the cover on the barbecue grill as the first drops of rain began to fall. He looked up at the sky, then back at the house. Our eyes met through the glass. He held my gaze for a second too long before walking toward the door. He stepped inside just as the rain began to fall in earnest. His shirt was damp, clinging to his shoulders, and he kicked off his shoes before entering the kitchen. I handed him a towel without speaking. He took it and dried his arms slowly, his expression unreadable. The silence thickened, made heavier by the sound of rain pounding against the windows and roof. "Storm's coming in faster than they said," he finally remarked. I nodded. "Looks like it." He lingered there for a moment, towel in hand, eyes scanning the room as if looking for something that wasn't there. Then he excused himself and went upstairs. I exhaled deeply the moment he was gone. Later, after the rain had settled into a steady rhythm, I decided to take a bath. Not for relaxation, but for solitude. The bathroom was the one place I could be alone without questions, without expectations. I filled the tub, added a few drops of eucalyptus oil, and sank into the warmth. The scent rose with the steam, filling my lungs, calming my nerves. I closed my eyes and tried to let go of the buzzing thoughts in my mind. But they clung to me, persistent and unyielding. Thoughts of how long it had been since someone looked at me the way he did. Not with ownership, or indifference, or obligation, but with attention. Simple, focused attention. It wasn't desire that had unraveled me. It was the shock of being seen. The reminder that I still had a self beyond the roles I played. That there were still parts of me that could be awakened, even after I had convinced myself they no longer existed. The water cooled. I stepped out and dried off, wrapping myself in a towel and moving back to my room. As I opened the door, I nearly collided with him in the hallway. He froze. I froze. A breath held between us. He stepped back immediately, apologizing. I murmured something, I don't remember what, and slipped into my room, heart pounding in my chest. It was nothing. An accident. A coincidence of timing. But the way he looked at me in that moment, the way his eyes dropped and rose again, not lingering, but not avoiding, it left a mark. That evening, we cooked together. The storm outside continued, lightning flickering occasionally behind the kitchen windows. Inside, the light was warm and soft, casting long shadows across the floor. We moved in coordination again, he chopped, I stirred. We passed ingredients back and forth like partners in a quiet ritual. Over dinner, we talked more than usual. He told me a story about a friend of his who had gotten into a ridiculous argument with a neighbor over parking. I laughed genuinely, the sound startling me with its unfamiliarity. I shared a story of my own, something from years ago, something trivial but oddly comforting. The conversation felt natural. Unforced. It reminded me of the kind of talks I used to have with my husband, back when talking didn't feel like work. After the dishes were cleared and the leftovers packed away, we lingered in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching the rain. I stood nearby, drying my hands. "I should probably head back soon," he said quietly. I looked at him. "Do you want to?" He hesitated. "I'm not sure." Neither was I. About anything. He didn't leave that night. But he didn't stay with me either. We returned to our separate rooms, the space between us intact but fragile. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain fade into nothing. Sleep came slowly, in pieces. And through it all, one thought kept circling in my mind, quiet but relentless. Something had shifted again. And I no longer knew how to shift it back. The morning arrived quietly, but with a weight I couldn't explain. Something in the air felt heavier than before. Maybe it was the aftermath of the storm, or maybe it was the way we had hovered the night before, so close to something unspoken. I lay in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, letting the faint light filter through the curtains. I wasn't tired, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Downstairs, I could hear faint movement, the creak of a chair, the soft clang of silverware. He was awake. I imagined him sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, pretending to read a newspaper or scroll through his phone. We were both performing normalcy now, like it was a game with rules neither of us had written. Eventually, I got up, showered, dressed in a soft knit sweater and jeans, something modest and neutral. I didn't want to think too hard about what I wore, but I did. That was the truth of it. I avoided makeup, but I brushed my hair more carefully than usual. It was subtle, but intentional. I didn't want to look like I was trying, but I didn't want to disappear either. When I entered the kitchen, he looked up briefly, nodded, and offered a quiet morning. I returned the greeting and moved toward the counter to prepare tea instead of coffee. My stomach was unsettled, and I needed something calming. The silence between us wasn't hostile, it had become a kind of companion. Familiar, expected. And yet it never felt comfortable. We sat at the table across from each other, the light from the window cutting between us like a line we weren't allowed to cross. His eyes drifted toward mine occasionally, but never for long. I sipped my tea, careful not to let my hands tremble. It wasn't fear I was feeling. It was anticipation. Of what, I still didn't know. Midway through the morning, I decided to do some light cleaning. Not the obsessive kind I had resorted to earlier in the week, but the kind that felt productive. I dusted shelves, watered the plants, organized a few drawers. Anything to keep myself occupied, to stay ahead of the thoughts circling in my mind. He offered to help bring down a few storage boxes from the attic, things I hadn't touched in years but had always meant to sort through. I agreed. We worked side by side in the hallway, stacking boxes, flipping open lids, examining old photos and decorations I barely remembered owning. It was almost absurd how normal it felt, how the simplicity of the task allowed us to exist together without questioning what had been building between us. At one point, I found an old birthday card tucked into a box of papers. It was addressed to me, in my husband's handwriting. I opened it, read the short message, loving, generic, written years ago, and felt a strange ache in my chest. I set it aside and moved on. The afternoon passed without incident. We ate lunch on the porch as the clouds began to clear, the wind still cool but gentle. He spoke about a recent trip he had taken with friends, a camping weekend in the mountains. I listened, asked a few questions, smiled in the right places. I told a story of my own, about a trip from long ago, the kind that made us both laugh. It was easy, and I hated how easy it was. Because I knew what was coming. Later, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I went upstairs to tidy the linen closet. I wanted space, but I also wanted to be near him. I found myself doing this more and more, pretending to need something in a room he might pass, staying where I could hear his steps, feel his presence. It wasn't deliberate, not exactly. But it wasn't accidental either. When I came back down, I found him in the living room, leafing through an old photo album I had left out by mistake. He looked up, uncertain if he had intruded. I waved off the concern. I joined him on the couch, our shoulders just far enough apart to be appropriate. He turned the pages slowly. There were photos from holidays, from family gatherings, from times that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. I pointed to a picture of myself, taken years ago, laughing at something just out of frame. My hair was longer, my smile wide and unguarded. I barely recognized her. "You look happy there," he said. I answered. Or maybe I thought I was. He didn't reply. The silence between us lengthened, not awkward but loaded. He turned another page. We were looking at the past, but what hung between us was the present. I shifted slightly, brushing against his arm. It wasn't intentional, or perhaps it was, buried under layers of denial. He didn't move away. For a moment, we sat still, the room quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then I turned to him. And we kissed. It was brief. Simple. No preamble, no explanation. just a moment suspended in time, a culmination of everything we had both been avoiding. Our lips met, and for a heartbeat, nothing else existed. No guilt. No fear. No rules. Then it was over. We pulled back, slowly, carefully. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. I rose from the couch first, my knees unsteady. I walked to the window, pretending to look at the trees, at the wind pushing through their branches. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, not shocked, not broken. Just quiet. He remained seated. The moment passed, but it didn't leave. It settled around us, invisible and undeniable. That night, I didn't sleep. And for the first time, I didn't even try. The next morning arrived with a disquieting stillness, as though the entire house had agreed to hold its breath. I awoke before the light fully crept across the sky, not because of a sound or movement, but because my thoughts refused to rest. The kiss, brief as it had been, played in my mind like a film loop, not because it was passionate or shocking, but because it had felt inevitable. It had been waiting beneath the surface for days, maybe longer. It hadn't erupted, it had emerged. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of that moment press into my chest. I didn't feel regret, exactly. Not shame either. What I felt was harder to name, a dense, complicated knot of uncertainty. There was no pleasure in it, but no horror either. It simply was. And I didn't know what to do with that. Eventually, I rose, dressed in silence, and made my way downstairs. The floor was cool under my feet, the air in the kitchen still holding traces of last night's dinner. I moved through the motions of making tea, avoiding coffee that morning, as if caffeine might stir thoughts I wasn't ready to entertain. He was already outside. I noticed through the window, his figure in the yard, hands in his pockets, head tilted toward the sky. He didn't seem to be doing anything in particular, just standing, as though unsure of how to fill the morning now that something between us had shifted. When he came inside, we didn't speak about what had happened. He greeted me the same way he always did, morning, as if nothing had changed. And maybe, in some twisted way, that made it worse. The normalcy felt dishonest. We had crossed a threshold, and yet here we were, pretending we hadn't. We worked separately throughout the day. I cleaned out the hallway closet, sorting through coats we never wore, tossing gloves missing pairs and scarves with frayed edges. He offered to make lunch, and I let him. We ate at the table like nothing had passed between us. The silence was no longer neutral, though. It pulsed with unsaid things. The kiss itself had not been wild. It hadn't been heated or impulsive. It had been quiet, restrained, almost reverent. But the fact that it had happened, that we had let it, made everything feel fragile. As if each step we took could trigger a collapse. In the early afternoon, a message arrived from my husband. He wanted to come home earlier than planned. Something about a cancelled meeting, an open window in his schedule. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I typed my response, carefully choosing words that sounded neutral. I told him we were fine, that the house was in order, that the garden was looking better after the rain. I didn't tell him how long I had spent in that garden over the past few days, pulling weeds with trembling hands, avoiding mirrors, and navigating conversations that ended too early or lasted too long. After sending the message, I sat in the living room with a book open in my lap. I didn't read. My mind spun. He walked past me once, twice, pausing slightly each time, but never speaking. We were like figures in a delicate dance, afraid to step out of rhythm. At some point, I heard him on the phone in the next room. His voice low, casual. A conversation with a friend, maybe. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone held a steadiness I found both comforting and infuriating. He seemed so composed. I didn't feel composed. I felt like I was made of fragile glass, one breath away from cracking. By the time evening arrived, the air between us had thickened to the point of near suffocation. I suggested we make something simple for dinner, a soup, a salad, nothing that required collaboration. He agreed, and we moved through the kitchen in silence again, the occasional clink of a spoon or the rush of water the only punctuation. We ate quickly. I cleared the table, washed the dishes by hand though the dishwasher sat empty and waiting. He lingered nearby, wiping the counter, his movements slow. As I dried the final plate, I realized I was gripping it too tightly. I set it down and turned to face him. He stood still, not speaking, not moving closer, just watching me. There was no tension in his shoulders, no expectation in his eyes, only a quiet question. One I didn't know how to answer. I exhaled. This can't happen again. He nodded, slowly. Okay. But we both knew it wasn't a promise. It was a wish. That night, I paced in my room, unable to settle. I opened the window for air, then closed it again when the breeze felt too sharp. I turned the lamp on, then off. Every action felt like a delay tactic. I wanted clarity, but it didn't exist. At some point, I found myself at the top of the stairs, unsure how I'd gotten there. I stood for a moment, listening. The house was quiet. I imagined him in the guest room, lying awake, staring at the ceiling just like I had the night before. I didn't go to him. I returned to my room, pulled the blanket up to my chest, and waited for sleep to find me. It didn't. Instead, I lay awake, eyes open in the dark, wondering how a single kiss could rearrange so much without ever speaking a word. Wondering how a body long ignored could remember what it felt like to be wanted, and what that remembering could cost. The morning began with a kind of mechanical rhythm. The sky was pale, the sun hidden behind a soft gray haze, and the air inside the house was still. I moved through my routine with practiced hands, brushing my hair, buttoning my blouse, setting the kettle on the stove, all without allowing my mind to linger on anything specific. It was safer that way. If I started thinking too deeply, I wasn't sure where it would lead. He had already left the house by the time I came downstairs. His absence wasn't unusual, he had always been someone who preferred movement to idleness. But today, it felt deliberate. I could sense the space he had created, the way he had removed himself from the tension, as though he thought giving me room might lessen the weight of it. It didn't. I sat at the table with my tea, staring at the wood grain patterns and tracing them with my fingertip. The house, usually so full of subtle, living noise, felt too quiet. The silence was no longer companionable, it had taken on a kind of edge, the kind that made the walls seem closer than they were. I felt as though the house was waiting, watching, holding its breath. Around midday, I decided to clean the upstairs hallway, not because it needed it, but because I needed something to do. I vacuumed, dusted the baseboards, adjusted picture frames that hadn't moved in years. Each task gave my hands a purpose, something tangible to focus on. But my mind wandered in spite of me. I thought about the kiss again, not the sensation, not even the moment itself, but the consequences. Not the dramatic kind, the cinematic unraveling of secrets and betrayal. But the quiet kind, the kind that shifts how you see yourself. How you look at your own reflection and feel like a stranger is staring back. I didn't want to feel that again. And yet, I couldn't unfeel it. Later in the afternoon, he returned. I heard the back door open and the shuffle of his shoes on the mat. I remained upstairs, half hoping he wouldn't come looking for me, half hoping he would. He didn't. Not right away. When I finally went down, he was in the kitchen, rinsing vegetables in the sink. He looked up when I entered, his face unreadable. I nodded toward the counter. Planning something? Just dinner, he said, his voice even. I moved toward the fridge, pretending to look for something, though I already knew we didn't need anything else. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the cold air brush my face, as if it could ground me. When I finally shut the door, I could feel his eyes on me. The silence stretched. "I think I'll stay in the guest house tonight," he said suddenly. I turned to him. He wasn't avoiding my gaze, he met it directly, with quiet resolve. "Just for some space," he added. "Not because of anything else." I nodded slowly, unsure what to say. Maybe it was a good idea. Maybe space was exactly what we needed. Or maybe it was the first step toward detaching completely. I didn't know which one I feared more. We ate dinner with the windows open, the air cool and gentle. A few birds called out in the distance, and the scent of jasmine drifted in from the garden. The meal was quiet. We spoke only of small things, the weather, the news, the coming weekend. It was a relief not to talk about anything that mattered, and also a kind of agony. After dinner, we both lingered in the kitchen longer than usual. I wiped down the counters twice. He dried the dishes more slowly than necessary. Neither of us said it, but we both knew this was the end of something, or maybe the beginning of something else entirely. As the sun began to set, he gathered a small overnight bag, nothing dramatic, just essentials, and left through the back door. I watched him cross the yard, his figure outlined against the golden light. He didn't look back. I didn't expect him to. I stood there for a long time after he disappeared into the guest house. The distance between the two buildings wasn't much, just a few dozen steps, but it felt enormous. A chasm had opened, not just in space but in understanding. And neither of us had a map to bridge it. That night, the house felt larger than ever. Every room echoed slightly, every creak of the floorboards sounded amplified. I moved from one space to another, restless, unable to settle. I considered calling my husband, but the thought died before I reached for my phone. What would I even say? Eventually, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window in the living room. I watched the soft lights glowing from the guest house. They were dim, warm, not harsh like overhead bulbs. They made the little house look peaceful, almost like it belonged to someone else entirely. I wondered what he was thinking. If he was sleeping. If he was pacing like I was. If he felt the same hollowness in his chest, the same uncertainty about everything we had said and left unsaid. Then my phone buzzed. I reached for it without thinking, a jolt of something electric moving through me. The message was short. "Hope you're okay." I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "I'm not sure what I am." He didn't answer right away. Minutes passed. I didn't move. Then the reply came. "Same." We left it there. That simple exchange, as quiet and restrained as the days leading up to it, said everything that needed to be said, and nothing at all. I turned off the lamp, walked upstairs, and slid beneath the sheets. The bed was cold. The room was still. And though I closed my eyes, sleep stayed far from me. Just like everything else I once thought I could control. The morning began with a gray sky and the smell of rain still lingering in the air, as if the world had just been scrubbed clean but left unfinished. I woke with a dull ache in my chest, not from grief or regret, but from a weight that had been building for days, the weight of too many things left unspoken, too many boundaries crossed and redrawn in silence. I didn't rise immediately. Instead, I lay in bed and listened to the faint sounds of the house, the occasional creak of old wood, the shifting wind brushing against the windows. I knew he was still in the guest house. The distance between us had taken on a physical form now, a deliberate separation that offered neither comfort nor clarity. It was strange, how close we had become without ever fully touching each other, and how far apart we now felt despite having shared something that could not be undone. Eventually, I got up, pulled on a sweater, and made my way downstairs. The kitchen was quiet. I moved slowly, boiling water for tea, letting the routine ground me in something familiar. I had no plan for the day. There was laundry to be done, perhaps some grocery shopping, but none of it felt urgent. What felt urgent was the space inside me that had been disturbed, not shattered, not broken, but stirred. And I didn't know what it needed. As I sipped my tea, I glanced out the window and saw him walking across the yard. He didn't look up. His expression was unreadable, his pace unhurried. He wasn't coming to the house, just passing by, heading toward the shed, perhaps, or the garden. It was impossible to know. I didn't wave. I didn't move. I simply watched him go. That momentary glimpse unsettled me more than I expected. There had been a kind of silence between us that I had grown accustomed to, but now it was beginning to feel like avoidance. Like we were both afraid of what would happen if we acknowledged what lingered between us. And maybe we were right to be afraid. By midday, I had cleaned out the pantry and organized the spice rack, meaningless tasks that gave me just enough distraction to stop myself from walking out to the guest house and demanding a conversation I wasn't ready to have. I hated how much space he took up in my mind, how every quiet second became a question about what he was thinking, what he wanted, and whether I had led him into this, or whether we had led each other. The sound of my phone broke the stillness. A message from my husband. He was finalizing plans to return tomorrow. I stared at the screen, rereading his words, the casual tone of them. There was no suspicion in his message, no edge. Just a sense of normalcy that made my stomach twist. How was it possible that he had no idea? That nothing in my voice, my responses, my timing had tipped him off? I replied with polite enthusiasm. I asked about his flight. I told him I'd prepare his favorite meal for the night he arrived. I lied, smoothly and without hesitation. After sending the message, I went to the living room and sat on the couch, staring at nothing. My mind was loud. I thought about the way things had changed so gradually that I hadn't even noticed. The quiet drifting of my marriage into something more like a partnership of convenience than a relationship. The absence of touch, of conversation that mattered. The way I had learned to fill the silence with busy work and half-felt emotions. And now, this. This strange, tangled connection with someone I should never have seen in that way. Someone who had offered something I didn't know I needed: attention, presence, the acknowledgement that I was still someone worth noticing. I stood up abruptly, needing air. I slipped on my shoes and stepped outside. The sky was still overcast, the wind cooler now. I walked toward the garden without thinking, my steps automatic. As I rounded the corner, I saw him again, sitting on the edge of the stone wall, staring out toward the trees. He looked up when he heard me approach. Our eyes met for the first time in what felt like days. There was no smile, no greeting. Just recognition. I got a message, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He's coming home tomorrow. He nodded slowly. I figured it'd be soon. I sat beside him, leaving a careful space between us. We didn't speak for a while. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. Finally, I spoke again. What happened? I haven't made sense of it yet. You don't have to, he replied. Not now. But I do, I said. Because everything is about to go back to normal. And I don't even know what that means anymore. He didn't respond right away. Then, softly, do you want it to? That question sat between us like a weight. I didn't have an answer. Or rather, I had too many. I wanted comfort. I wanted certainty. I wanted to rewind time and also move it forward. I wanted to be someone who hadn't let this happen. And I wanted to be someone who had dared to want something more. I don't know, I admitted. We sat in silence again. The air around us was calm, but nothing about the moment felt settled. I could feel the clock ticking inside me, every second bringing us closer to the return of what was, the house, the routine, the version of myself I had been trying to escape. Eventually, I stood. I should go back in. He nodded, but didn't move. As I turned to leave, I heard him say, "You're not the only one who's confused." I stopped, then kept walking. That night, I set the table for one. I reheated leftover soup, cut a piece of bread, and poured myself a glass of water. The act felt hollow. I ate slowly, mechanically, my thoughts looping endlessly. After dinner, I stood by the window again, looking out at the lights in the guest house. They were on. He was there. Still close, but not with me. And then I made a decision I hadn't planned to make. I walked upstairs, changed into something warm, pulled on my coat, and stepped outside. I crossed the yard without hurrying. And I knocked on his door. We spent the night together. Morning arrived, but I didn't feel it in the usual way. It wasn't the light filtering through the curtains or the familiar creaks of the house that woke me, it was the awareness of what had passed, and what could no longer be taken back. I lay still in the unfamiliar bed of the guest house, eyes open, the ceiling above me a flat, indifferent gray. The weight of the night before wasn't regret. It was something more complex, not guilt, not longing, but the raw acknowledgement of a line crossed that no amount of silence could erase. I moved slowly, deliberately, as though each movement had to be earned. The small guest house was quiet. He wasn't in the room. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting my feet rest on the cold floor for a long moment before standing. I didn't feel shame. But I didn't feel peace either. I felt suspended, like I was caught between the version of myself I had always been and the one who had quietly emerged in the stillness of this private place, when the rest of the world was asleep. I found him in the kitchen, standing by the window, sipping from a cup. He didn't turn when I entered. I didn't speak either. For a while, we just shared the same space, surrounded by the kind of silence that felt more like acceptance than avoidance. Eventually, I stepped beside him and poured myself a glass of water. My fingers trembled slightly as I drank, not from nerves, but from a subtle current of adrenaline that still hadn't left me. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't need to. The fact of it was present in the air, in the way we moved around each other, no longer tiptoeing, but not quite steady either. I left without saying goodbye. The walk back across the yard felt longer than it ever had. The house loomed before me, quiet and still, but not empty. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me with a softness I hadn't intended, as if I were trying not to wake someone, or something, that might ask questions I couldn't answer. Upstairs, I peeled off the clothes I had slept in and showered. The water was hot, the pressure sharp. I scrubbed my skin harder than necessary, not because I wanted to erase anything, but because I needed to feel something that wasn't confusion. My body didn't feel different, but my mind did. It had shifted, realigned, and I didn't know where to place anything anymore. By the time I came downstairs again, the day was already unfolding. Sunlight streamed in through the kitchen window, too bright, too cheerful for what I was carrying inside. I made coffee out of habit, but it tasted wrong. Everything did. The air. The light. The silence. The clock ticked forward without mercy. By noon, I had cleaned the kitchen twice, reorganized a drawer of old mail, and started laundry I didn't need to do. I couldn't sit still. I couldn't think clearly either. I kept waiting for clarity to arrive, for some voice inside me to declare what this all meant, what I was supposed to do with it. Instead, the doorbell rang. I froze. It wasn't him. I knew that instinctively. He would never ring the doorbell. My heart thudded once, hard, before I moved toward the front of the house. I opened the door to find a delivery man holding a small package. I signed for it with a hand that didn't feel like mine and closed the door again, leaning my forehead against it for a moment after it latched. Just a delivery. Nothing more. But the sound, the interruption, it had brought me crashing back into the present. And the present was complicated. Around 3 in the afternoon, I got another message from my husband. He had landed early and was heading home. His tone was light. He said he missed me, that he was looking forward to dinner, that he hoped I was getting some rest. I stared at the screen, the message perfectly ordinary, perfectly warm. I didn't know how to respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I no longer knew how to exist inside the version of our marriage he still believed in. The version where everything was stable, predictable, safe. I eventually typed out a reply, a simple acknowledgement, "I can't wait to see you," complete with a smiley emoji I didn't feel. I sent it before I could think too long about it. Then I stood in the middle of the kitchen, phone still in my hand, and asked myself what kind of woman I had become. The hours leading up to his return moved with a strange momentum. I cooked. I cleaned. I set the table. I ironed a blouse I didn't even plan to wear. All of it was done with mechanical precision, like I was playing a role I used to know by heart but now had to study again. I moved through the house like someone rehearsing a memory, trying to remember which emotions went with which actions. When his car pulled into the driveway, I was already standing at the window, watching. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't tremble. What I felt was something heavier than panic, the knowledge that the truth was now a part of me, whether he ever discovered it or not. I opened the door before he could knock. His smile was wide, familiar, his arms open. He hugged me tightly, kissed my cheek, brought with him the scent of airplane cabins and hotel shampoo. He stepped inside, wheeled his suitcase behind him, and began talking about his flight, about the delays, about a couple he'd met on the plane who had been traveling for their anniversary. I listened. I nodded. I smiled at all the right moments. But I wasn't fully there. At dinner, we ate by candlelight. He praised the meal, complimented the wine, told a story about a client who had made a fool of himself during a conference call. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I didn't want to forget how to laugh with him. After we cleared the plates and washed the dishes, we sat in the living room, shoulder to shoulder, sipping tea. He leaned back, sighed, and said, "It's good to be home." And I replied, "Yes. It is." But even as I said it, I felt the shape of my answer bending under the weight of what I couldn't say. Later, after he had gone to bed, I remained downstairs. I sat in the same chair I had sat in every night while he was away, staring out the window toward the yard. The guest house was dark now. Quiet. And yet, everything inside me still echoed with what had happened there. Sleep did not come easily. I lay in bed beside the man I had promised my life to, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. And I wondered how many versions of myself I had become over the years, and whether any of them were truly honest. One thing I knew for certain, there was no going back. Not because I didn't want to, but because I no longer could. The following days unfolded with a strange symmetry, as if the return of my husband had pressed the house back into its usual shape. The furniture stood still, the clocks ticked in steady rhythm, and the walls echoed with familiar patterns, the sound of his footsteps, the shuffle of newspapers, the soft clink of a coffee cup set on the counter just slightly too hard. Everything had returned to what it was before. On the surface. But I hadn't. I moved through our routines with a quiet efficiency that felt both automatic and false. I smiled when expected, laughed when prompted, kissed his cheek when he left for work. I cooked his favorite meals. I asked about his day. I listened. I nodded. I performed. And all the while, there was a low hum beneath everything, like a second heartbeat only I could hear, reminding me that I was no longer fully present inside this life. He didn't notice. Or if he did, he mistook it for fatigue, or distraction, or some residual tiredness from the week he'd been away. He was kind. Attentive, even. He tried to reconnect. He asked if I wanted to plan a weekend away, maybe go back to the coast where we'd once spent an anniversary. I said it sounded nice. I meant it, in the sense that I wanted to want it. But something had shifted too deeply in me to be reached by shared plans and nostalgia. I avoided the guest house. Not overtly, I didn't flinch when he mentioned it, didn't change the subject if it came up. But I didn't walk past it. I didn't let my eyes settle on its windows. I didn't go near it after dark. It stood at the edge of our property like a sealed-off chapter, quietly humming with memory. I imagined him there, still staying inside it, still waking up to the same silence I did, but with the benefit of distance. He didn't come to the main house anymore, and I didn't ask why. We had created our own kind of truce, one where we kept the balance by keeping our distance. And somehow, I respected that. We had broken something sacred together, but we hadn't shattered it. Not yet. We had pressed our hands against the glass, but we hadn't shattered through. And yet, each day I lived inside that restraint, I felt it pulling tighter. On the third evening after my husband's return, I went to bed early. He stayed downstairs watching something, the television low, the glow flickering behind the cracks of the closed door. I lay in bed with the lights off, the window cracked open, the air cool against my skin. I listened to the house. I listened to my breath. I waited. But sleep did not come. I thought about that night, the walk across the yard, the knock on the door, the quiet way I had stepped inside. The way we didn't speak. The way everything between us had been a choice and not a mistake. I thought about how his hands had trembled, not with urgency, but with fear. And how mine had trembled back. I didn't regret it. I regretted what it meant. The next morning, my husband left early for a work meeting. He kissed my temple as I sat at the kitchen table, and I offered him a small smile in return. I watched the car disappear down the road and waited a full 10 minutes before standing. I didn't know what I was going to do. I only knew that I couldn't keep floating in the space between two truths. I walked out into the garden. The air was damp with morning dew, the ground soft under my feet. I moved slowly, past the hedges, past the flower beds, until I stood in view of the guest house. The blinds were closed. The porch light was off. Everything was still. I turned around. I didn't knock. Not because I didn't want to. But because I wasn't there to revisit something. I was there to end it. Instead, I went back inside and started stripping the guest bed. I changed the linens. I washed the towels. I opened the windows and let the breeze carry through the empty rooms. I moved slowly, methodically, like I was preparing for something else. Or maybe closing something for good. Later that day, I sat down at my desk and began to write a letter. Not to him. To myself. I wrote about how I had forgotten what it meant to be seen. I wrote about how easy it had become to be absent from my own life. I wrote about the moments that led me to where I was now, not to justify them, not to confess them, but to understand them. I wrote until my hand cramped, until my eyes burned, until I felt like I could finally hear my own voice again. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. It wasn't meant for anyone else to read. That night, my husband came home tired. He poured a drink, sat beside me on the couch, and leaned his head back with a sigh. I turned to look at him, really look at him. The man I had married. The man I had drifted from. The man who still smiled at me in the morning like nothing had changed. And maybe, for him, nothing had. But for me, everything had. I reached out and took his hand. He opened his eyes, surprised. I didn't say anything. I just held it, gently, like I was learning how to again. That's the thing about betrayal, it doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it whispers through the quiet choices we make. Through the small distances we allow. Through the truths we avoid naming. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it becomes a reckoning. Not just with someone else, but with ourselves.